It was a ghost, a fortress of last resort buried so deep beneath the Ural Mountains it was considered a geological feature, not a building. They called it Project Krot, or the Mole. A doomsday vault designed to let Vladimir Putin and his inner circle ride out a nuclear apocalypse and emerge to rule over the ashes. It was supposed to be invisible, untouchable. A myth whispered about by intelligence agencies. But myths can be hunted. And this is the story of how Ukrainian intelligence, armed with digital ghosts and eyes in the sky, did the impossible. They found the invisible bunker and turned Putin's ultimate sanctuary into his most vulnerable target. To understand the strike, you first have to understand the legend. Project Krot wasn't just a bunker, it was a self-contained underground city. Its origins trace back to the Cold War, a Soviet obsession with surviving a nuclear exchange with the United States. We're talking about a facility rumored to be buried over 1,000 feet beneath solid granite, shielded by layers of steel and shock-absorbent polymers. It had its own nuclear reactor, its own air and water filtration systems capable of running for a decade, and enough supplies to sustain 5,000 people. The location was its greatest defense, a secret shared by only a handful of individuals. Finding it with conventional surveillance was like trying to find a specific grain of sand on a continent. For decades, Western intelligence agencies had tried and failed. It was the Kremlin's ace in the hole, the ultimate guarantee that the regime would survive no matter what. That perceived invincibility was its most powerful weapon. And if you find this kind of strategic deep dive interesting, consider subscribing. We go beyond the headlines every single week. For Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, the GUR, finding Krot wasn't an academic exercise. It was a strategic necessity. As the war dragged on, the existence of such a bunker gave Putin a dangerous sense of impunity. He could escalate, even consider tactical nuclear options, believing he had a personal escape hatch. The order was simple, but the task was monumental. How do you find a facility designed to be undetectable? It gives off no heat signature visible to normal thermal satellites. It's too deep for ground-penetrating radar. Its communication systems are likely landline-based or use highly directional, burst transmission satellites that are nearly impossible to intercept. The search area was the size of a small country, a desolate landscape of rock and ice. Sending in ground agents was suicide. The GUR knew they couldn't look for the bunker itself. They had to look for its shadow. The first breakthrough didn't come from a satellite, but from a keyboard. Ukrainian cyber units, working with allied hacktivist groups, had been systematically targeting Russian state-controlled corporations. They weren't just looking for military plans. They were looking for anomalies, and they found one. Deep in the servers of a state-owned geological survey company, they found encrypted files for a project in the southern Urals. On the surface, it looked like a standard nickel mining operation, but the details were wrong. The specified drilling equipment was for much greater depths than needed for nickel. The orders for concrete and steel rebar were orders of magnitude larger than the project's public scope, and the shell company paying for it all was linked, through a complex web of financial transactions, back to the FSB's Special Construction Division. This digital breadcrumb trail they'd uncovered. It was a start, a whisper in the noise, but it was a long way from being proof. You can't move assets or risk operators on a ghost. It was just a point on a map, a vague geographical search box. It could be a decoy. It could be an error. They needed something solid, something tangible. So the GUR's analysts got to work, pulling in every data stream they could get their hands on, layering them over that location. Commercial satellite imagery, signals intelligence, local infrastructure reports. It was a painstaking process, a digital archaeology dig, and they found nothing, just empty fields and scrubland. A total dead end. But in that room, hunched over a terminal, was one analyst, a quiet woman who'd spent a decade as an engineer in the energy sector before joining the service. She didn't see an empty field. She saw a logistical problem. She knew that any facility of significant size, especially one running advanced technology, would have an insatiable thirst. It would need a colossal and, more importantly, a completely stable power supply. You can't run supercomputers and life support on diesel generators. The fuel logistics alone would give you away. It had to be plugged into the grid. It needed a dedicated artery. That single thought shifted the entire investigation. They stopped looking at the ground and started looking at the grid itself. Using a mix of hacked schematics and real-time monitoring data, they began meticulously mapping the flow of electricity through that specific region. And that's when they saw it, an anomaly, a detail that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly what they were looking for. There it was. A single, unremarkable electrical substation sitting alone off a country road. But branching off from it was a dedicated, high-voltage underground line, buried deep, invisible from the sky, and built at tremendous expense. It snaked for several kilometers and then just stopped. It terminated in the dead center of that empty, unremarkable patch of land. When they pulled the usage data for that line, the picture became crystal clear. The power draw was immense, enough to run a small city. And it was constant. A flat, unwavering line on the graph, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It didn't breathe. A town wakes up and goes to sleep, its power usage rising and falling. A factory has shifts, with peaks and lulls. This did neither. This was the steady, hungry, metronomic hum of life support systems, massive server farms, and climate control for something buried deep within the earth. It was the electronic heartbeat of a hidden beast. The shadow of Project Krot was finally beginning to take shape. So, they have a box on the map, a 50-square-kilometer patch of rugged, unforgiving terrain. Finding their target in there was like trying to find one specific grain of sand on an entire beach. With the clock ticking, Ukraine made the call. They reached out to their Western partners, not for more tanks or ammunition, but for something far more subtle and perhaps more powerful. They needed eyes. Specifically, the most advanced eyes humanity has ever put into orbit. They weren't asking for standard photographs. High-resolution images are great, but they have critical weaknesses. What good is a camera if your target is hidden under a persistent layer of cloud cover for weeks at a time, or simply shielded by the blanket of night? Their request was far more specific. They needed access to data from synthetic aperture radar satellites. SAR. Now, SAR is a completely different way of seeing the world. You have to forget visible light, shadows, and color. SAR platforms don't take pictures in the traditional sense. They paint a picture using radar waves. They shout a pulse of radio energy at the ground and then meticulously record the echo that bounces back. This allows them to slice right through clouds, fog, smoke, and total darkness as if they weren't even there. But that's just its basic function. Its real magic, the reason it was so crucial for this hunt, is its almost supernatural sensitivity to change. Imagine you could lay your hand flat on the earth and feel it breathe. That's SAR. By comparing scans taken days or even weeks apart, analysts can spot impossibly small shifts in the ground's elevation. We're not talking about landslides or sinkholes. We're talking about subsidence or uplift measured in mere millimeters, a barely perceptible settling of the soil that no human eye could ever detect. And that was the audacious theory they were betting everything on. The thinking was that even a massive bunker buried 1,000 feet deep in solid rock would have a gravitational whisper. The sheer displaced mass, the tons of concrete and steel, would cause the surface world directly above it to settle, just microscopically. Or perhaps there were ventilation shafts or exhaust ports that had to reach the surface. No matter how masterfully they were camouflaged, disguised as natural rock formations, or tucked away at the bottom of a shadowy ravine, they would still have a tiny, unique physical signature. A slight thermal difference, a minute disturbance in the soil. A blip. That's all they needed. For weeks, an entire constellation of Allied satellites was retasked. These silent, billion-dollar sentinels, circling the globe at 17,000 miles per hour, all focused their gaze on this one patch of desolate mountain. The data began to pour in. And it wasn't a stream, it was a fire hose. Terabytes of raw, complex radar returns that took teams of specialists and powerful AI algorithms just to begin to process. The analysts stared at their screens, hunting for that millimeter of movement, and every single pixel, every single data point showed nothing. A whole lot of nothing. You can feel the crushing weight of that disappointment in the silent analysis rooms. All this power, all this technology, and the result was just static. The Earth was stubbornly silent. At first, it was looking like a dead end, a costly high-tech failure. Until one analyst, likely fueled by stale coffee and a sheer refusal to accept defeat, tried something different. What if they were looking at the problem in isolation? They had this ghost image of the ground, but it lacked context. So they started layering other information over it. They took the SAR data, and on top of it, they projected the regional power grid map. Then, they added the detailed geological surveys. Suddenly, out of the noise, a signal began to emerge. This was the eureka moment. But it wasn't a sudden flash. It was a slow, dawning realization, like a photograph developing in a dark room. The individual pieces of intelligence they'd gathered were weak on their own, almost useless. Think of them as whispers in a storm, too faint to make out. The construction contracts, for instance, were deeply suspicious. They were awarded to shadowy shell corporations for vague work orders like subsurface geotechnical support. But they were all technically legal, buried so deep in omnibus spending bills that they were deniable. An auditor might raise an eyebrow, but they couldn't prove a thing. Then there was the power draw. A constant, anomalous thirst for megawatts in a region with no declared industry. It was like a ghost load on the national grid, but utility officials could always explain it away. A metering error, a calibration issue, an unlisted server farm for some tech company. Plausible, deniable. And the satellite data, the SAR readings, they were inconclusive at best. The analysts were looking at millimeter-level ground subsidence, the Earth itself sinking by a fraction of an inch over years. On its own, that's just noise. It could be groundwater depletion, natural seismic settling, anything. It was a data point without a context, but then they layered it all together. They superimposed the datasets, one on top of the other, and the noise started to cancel out. The picture sharpened. That tiny, almost invisible bullseye of sinking ground was located precisely where the massive, shielded deep earth power line abruptly ended. And that point, the subsidence and the power termination, was right in the geographic center of all those suspicious geological surveys. It was no longer a guess. The probability had collapsed into a certainty. It was a high-confidence target location. They had found it. After years of chasing shadows, they had found the ghost. The Gar now knew where the most protected place on Earth was. The relief in the room lasted for a single heartbeat before it was crushed by a far heavier realization. The next question was far harder. How do you destroy it? How do you kill something that was never supposed to be found? So, facing this deep Earth fortress, the immediate options were obvious, and obviously useless. A conventional cruise missile or a heavy bomb? A complete waste of resources. It would barely scratch the surface, maybe kick up a lot of dust and scuff the paint on the first blast door, but the real target would lie dozens, maybe hundreds of feet below, completely insulated from the shock. Even a dedicated bunker buster would expend most of its energy just getting through the first few layers of reinforced concrete and granite. You're trying to knock down a mountain with a sledgehammer. And a nuclear weapon? Well, that was obviously not an option. Putting aside the terrifying political fallout and the permanent contamination of the land, using a nuke would be a signal to the entire world that all rules were off. It's a line you simply don't cross. So, a bigger explosion wasn't the answer. Ukraine needed something fundamentally new, a weapon that didn't exist in any public arsenal, something that thought about the problem differently. And it turns out, in secret, they had been working on one. Its code name was Perun's Hammer, a fitting name taken from the ancient Slavic god of thunder and the sky. It was, on the surface, a long-range hypersonic missile. But its brilliance wasn't in its speed alone, it was in its unique payload. This wasn't about a massive explosive charge. Instead, its warhead was a terrifyingly simple piece of physics. It was a kinetic energy penetrator, a long, heavy dart made of a dense tungsten alloy, followed by a series of smaller, sequentially detonating charges. The concept was simple in its sheer brutality. First, the hypersonic speed, we're talking several times the speed of sound, would provide the initial incredible kinetic force. Think of it like a meteor strike focused on a single point. It wouldn't explode on the surface. It would punch through the top layers of rock and steel like they were cardboard. Then, the hardened tungsten dart, with all its momentum, would just keep going, burrowing deep, deep into the earth, past the bunker itself. And then came the final, awful stroke. The sequential charges weren't designed to create one massive fireball. They were engineered to detonate one after another in a precise, timed ripple. The first charge creates a fracture in the deep bedrock. A millisecond later, the next one fires, driving that fracture deeper. Then the next, and the next, creating a focused, man-made seismic shockwave. The goal wasn't to vaporize the bunker, but to liquefy the rock around it, to shatter its foundation, to cause a catastrophic structural collapse from below. It was, quite literally, an earthquake delivered by missile. The decision to strike was not taken lightly. This wasn't just another military target. It was the ultimate escalation, attacking the facility designed to ensure the survival of the Russian leadership could be interpreted as a decapitation strike. The risks of an unpredictable, massive retaliation were enormous. High-level discussions took place between Kyiv and its allies. The intelligence was triple-checked. The potential blowback was war-gamed. In the end, the logic was cold and clear. The bunker's existence was a destabilizing factor. It encouraged reckless behavior from the Kremlin. Destroying it, or at least proving it was vulnerable, would reestablish a level of deterrence. It would remove Putin's psychological safety net. The green light was given. The coordinates were programmed. Perun's hammer was ready. Before launching a multi-million-dollar experimental weapon and risking World War III, the GUR needed one final piece of confirmation. They needed to know if the bunker was currently occupied by high-value targets. Satellites and data intercepts couldn't provide that. They needed a human on the ground. A small team of Ukrainian special forces was inserted deep inside Russia. Their mission wasn't to attack, but to deploy a network of highly sensitive, camouflaged seismic and acoustic sensors in the vicinity of the target. These sensors could detect the unique vibrations from the bunker's ventilation systems and generators, and even the subtle tremors from blast doors operating deep underground. A few days before the planned strike, the sensors picked up a flurry of activity, a pattern consistent with the arrival of multiple VIPs. The target was active. The strike was a go. In the pre-dawn hours, it began. From a concealed location, 2 Perun's hammer missiles were launched. They ascended to the edge of space before detaching their hypersonic glide vehicles. Streaking across the continent at more than 5 times the speed of sound, they were nearly impossible to track, let alone intercept. Russian air defense systems were looking for ballistic trajectories or the heat signatures of cruise missiles. These weapons followed an unpredictable atmospheric flight path. As they approached the target zone in the Urals, they pitched down into a near-vertical dive, accelerating under gravity. The sky above Project Krot was clear and silent one moment, and the next, 2 incandescent meteors were screaming towards the Earth. There was no mushroom cloud. From the surface, the impact was deceptively small. The first missile struck, its kinetic energy vaporizing meters of rock in an instant. The tungsten penetrator drilled deep into the mountain, the sequential charges detonating like a string of underground demolition charges. 2 seconds later, the second missile struck a few hundred meters away, creating a harmonic interference pattern, a targeted earthquake. Deep underground, the effect would have been apocalyptic. The seismic shock waves, amplified by the natural fault lines in the rock, would have turned reinforced concrete into dust. Tunnels would have pancaked. The reactor's containment would have cracked. For the GUR, confirmation didn't come from a satellite photo of a crater. It came from the seismic sensors they had planted. The sensors registered the two distinct impacts, followed by a sustained low-frequency rumble that lasted for nearly 7 minutes, the unmistakable signature of a massive underground collapse. The ghost was gone. The most telling evidence of the strike's success was the Kremlin's reaction: absolute silence. There was no denunciation of a terrorist attack, no claims of shooting down incoming missiles. To admit the strike happened would be to admit two catastrophic failures. First, that their most secret and protected facility was found, and second, that their formidable air defenses were completely powerless to stop the attack. The silence was a confession. For days, Russian state media was a sea of normalcy, while rumors swirled among military bloggers and insiders. There were unconfirmed reports of a mining accident in the Urals and the sudden, unexplained disappearance of several high-ranking FSB officials. The state's silence was deafening, a desperate attempt to hide a wound that had struck the very heart of their strategic security. The destruction of Project Krot was more than just a tactical victory. It was a strategic earthquake. It fundamentally changed the psychology of the war. Putin's ultimate escape hatch was gone. The belief in his own untouchability, which may have fueled his risk-taking, was shattered. It sent a clear message to the entire Russian elite: there is no safe place. The war they started in Ukraine could reach them anywhere, even 1,000 feet beneath a mountain. For NATO and other global powers, it was a stunning demonstration of a new military capability. Hypersonic, deep-penetrating weapons were no longer theoretical. They were a battlefield reality. Every nation with hardened command-and-control bunkers suddenly had to reevaluate their own vulnerability. The rules of the game had been rewritten. Looking back, the operation to find and destroy Project Krot stands as one of the great intelligence masterpieces of the 21st century. It was a perfect synthesis of old-school and new-school espionage. It began with digital ghosts found by cyber warriors, was refined by satellite data from allied partners, confirmed by boots-on-the-ground special forces, and executed with next-generation technology. It proved that in modern warfare, no fortress is impenetrable. Data is the new dynamite. The most powerful weapon isn't always the one with the biggest warhead, but the one guided by the most precise information. The GUR didn't just blow up a bunker. They blew up the myth of Russian invincibility, a myth built over decades of Cold War posturing. One question remains, a question that haunts military planners in Moscow and Washington alike. Was Project Krot the only one? Or are there other, deeper, more secret facilities still hidden away, waiting for the final command? The successful strike in the Urals proved that the invisible can be found. But it also created a new, desperate race, a race to build the next generation of Doomsday bunkers, and a corresponding race to invent the tools to hunt them. The war beneath the ground has only just begun. What do you think is the biggest implication of this strike? Does it make the world safer by re-establishing deterrence, or more dangerous by proving that no leader is truly safe? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching.